Hello, hello, and welcome everyone. Let's take a couple of seconds to welcome our participants. ناخذ ثواني لنجمع أكثر عدد المشتركين قبل ما نبلش. Great. So, hello and welcome everyone to our fourth webinar of Kvinna Kvinna and Oxfam co-organized webinar series, The Road to COP27, Advancing Gender Equality Through Climate Action, where we will invite experts from around the globe to explore the intersections between climate change and gender-based violence. And today, in our fourth webinar, we will focus on understanding the linkages between climate change and gender-based violence. And we will host remarkable speakers from academia and UNFPA. This webinar will explore the linkages between climate change and gender, and how climate change is linked to issues like gender-based violence and sexual reproductive health rights. The webinar will present recent findings from the region that highlight how climate change related risks such as extreme heat, natural disasters, and displacement. And we will also present some existing approaches to address climate change in the MENA region. My name is Samah Elos, and I'm thrilled to be your guide for this fabulous set of speakers and this conversation we're going to have today. The main language of the webinar will be English. Simultaneous interpretation from English to Arabic and vice versa will be provided during the webinar. Just click on the below option to activate the interpretation. اللغة اللي سوف نتحدث بها اليوم هي اللغة الإنجليزية. لدينا ترجمة متزامنة مع حديث ضيوفنا من اللغة الإنجليزية للغة العربية وبالعكس موفرة خلال الويبينار. بإمكانكم تفعيل الترجمة بالنقر على خيار الترجمة الكرة الأرضية، أيقونة الكرة الأرضية الموجودة في أسفل الشاشة. And as a note, today's event is being recorded, and once we finish from the series, the whole series will be uploaded on Kvinna Kvinna YouTube channel. So we're going to have 3 speakers today, and at the end of the session, we will raise your questions. So please feel free to share with us your questions through the Q&A option at the bottom of the screen. So let's start. Let me introduce you more to the topic. Research has shown that there's a clear intersection between violence against women and climate change. When climate change, for example, causes drought and water scarcity, women and girls are often forced to travel longer distances to access these resources. And so they face increased security risks, including sexual violence and other forms of gender-based violence. The same goes for land scarcity, such as when rising sea levels flood the land, where the poorest and often women-led households reside. Since the climate crisis worsens poverty in many parts of the world, women and girls are also more vulnerable to trafficking and different forms of sexual exploitation. More girls will also be forced into child marriages. Understanding the linkages between climate change and gender-based violence and sexual reproductive rights is critical for us to be able to develop successful policies to fight and prevent gender-based violence in the region. We're fortunate today to have many experts with us to help us understand the connection and explore potential solutions from many different perspectives. So let's get it started. And we're starting with a perfect guide to kick off this conversation. Our speaker is going to speak in English, so please activate the interpretation for these who need interpretations. Jada Shikoniola, and we're going to have also Rachel Baba. Jada is the Gender-Based Violence Program Analyst at the UNFPA, Jordan. Prior to that, she worked with UNOPS on gender inclusion, urban planning, and has experience with local and international NGOs, as well as state lead agencies, focusing on human rights and gender issues in West Africa and the MENA region. Originally, she's from Italy, and she holds a Master in International Development from the University of Edinburgh in UK. And we also have Rachel Baba, which is a passionate humanitarian and women rights advocate. Rasha has worked with the UNFPA Jordan for almost 4 years as a campaigning and advocacy assistant to establish and organize advocacy campaigns to call an end to gender-based violence on an agency and interagency level by coordinating the campaign efforts of the gender-based violence and gender-based violence sub-working group. Rasha is also the gender focal point of the gender-based violence sub-working group in Jordan. Rasha and Jada will share the findings of UNFPA's recent report on the impact of climate change and gender-based violence in Jordan, and an overview about UNFPA work to address climate change in the MENA region. Very happy to have you with us today, and the mic is yours.
Thank you, Sama, and thank you, Rasha, for sharing the presentation. I hope everybody can see it. Thank you to you and to the organizers of this event. My name is Jada, and together with my colleague Rasha, we'll be here today to kind of give you an overview on the perspective of UNFPA on the interlinkages between gender-based violence and climate change, looking at it from a global, a regional, and a national perspective in Jordan specifically. Next, please. So I will not go too much into detail in giving you a background on the data, because I know that the speaker who will come after UNFPA will provide a thorough briefing on this. But just to give you a bit of an overview, climate change, of course, touches every region in the world in a different way. And its impacts are not the same depending on the country and depending on the population group that we are looking at. And just for like any other global emergency, as we've seen with COVID-19, for example, marginalized groups, including women and girls, they face a heightened risk posed by climate change. This is particularly true because climate change disproportionately affects poor and impacts poor people, and women constitute the majority of the world's poor and are dependent on threatened natural resources. In fact, 70% of the 1.3 billion people living in conditions of poverty are women, and in urban areas, we can just look at the data of 40% of the poorest households, which are headed by women. Now, UNFPA, as the United Nations Sexual and Reproductive Health Agency, is responding to the climate crisis by working to both reduce inequalities and also increase resilience. We have committed by 2030 to achieve 3 transformative results. These results are very much interlinked with our mandate and are the end of preventable maternal mortality, the end of unmet need for family planning, and to end gender-based violence and harmful practices. However, the rapid pace at which climate change is taking the world is making these transformative results very difficult to achieve. Climate change is a multiplier of existing vulnerabilities and is a threat to the vision of a human-centered sustainable development as it's advocated by both the Program of Action of the ICPD, the International Conference on Population and Development, and also the 2030 Agenda. Next, please. Now, I mentioned the 3 transformative results that we would like to achieve by 2030. And these are clearly interlinked with climate change effects. For example, if I'm looking at, I mentioned the prevention of the maternal mortality. Now, heat worsens maternal and neonatal health outcomes, and research suggests that an increase in 1 degree Celsius in the week before delivery corresponds to 6% greater likelihood of stillbirth. I also mentioned the unmet need for family planning, and climate-related emergencies cause major disruptions in access to health services and life-saving commodities, for example, contraception. And finally, I mentioned the end of gender-based violence and harmful practices, and climate-related loss or change in livelihoods, the displacement, the migration that can cause from it, they do increase the risk of gender-based violence and harmful practices, including, for example, child marriage. Now, UNFPA at the global level will try and is already trying to tackle all these issues by looking at policies, programs, partnerships, and innovative financing that can achieve the transformative results while at the same time counteracting the impacts of climate change. Next, please. Thank you. So the climate change crisis has, as we said, a disproportionate effect on the lives of women and girls. But to better understand such effect, UNFPA is, among other actions at the global level, working to generate data on this topic. For example, a recent collaboration with the Queen Mary University undertook a scoping review of the linkages between climate change and SRH outcomes. And the findings show that changes to the environment, they have profound implications for women and girls, their body autonomy, and they confirm that climate change has really a negative impact on almost all sexual and reproductive health and rights outcomes, leaving the most vulnerable women and girls at higher risk of being left behind. Now, of course, we'll be able to share such resources also later.
Jada, I'm sorry for interrupting you, but our interpreter asking us if you can go a little bit slower.
Of course, I'll go slower, sorry. Next, please. Thank you. So the zooming into the region, now we looked at the global level and zooming into the region of the Arab states, the MENA region is one of the world's hottest areas in the world. And this is due to the impact, of course, also of climate change. Of the 17 most water-scarce countries in the world, 11 are from this region, the Arab states. And the latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the one of 2022, actually indicates how climate change will increase the levels of water scarcity and the linked frequency also of droughts. Based on also another recent index, we found that 8 countries in the MENA region, they are at high risk of natural hazards such as earthquakes, floods, droughts, and more generally also epidemics. Now, while these hazards have been found to be drivers of child marriage and generally negative impacts on women and girls' health and social well-being, these linkages have not been adequately researched in the region yet. The magnitude, however, of the social and health consequences of such linkages is potentially very large, because if we consider, for example, that 1 in 5 girls are married in the region, the MENA region, before the age of 15, and we've seen the linkage potential between climate change and the magnitude, again, of the harmful practice of child marriage, we really need to further investigate on this topic to really understand how big the phenomenon and the reality is. Next, please. Now, of course, what we're doing at the regional level is to further investigate, as I was saying, the data is lacking, and we need to better understand the linkages between climate change and gender-based violence in order to inform our programming even better and support the states in their efforts to really counteract the impacts of climate change. Just to give you an example of some of the research pieces that we're going to work on in the next month, we'll be looking at a chapter that is going to contribute to the Women's Development Organization report that is going to be presented actually at COP27. And this chapter will look specifically at climate change and gender-based violence. We'll be also developing a study that looks more specifically into climate change and child marriage and female genital mutilation. And this is, of course, this is actually expected for next year. And the objective is twofold, is to better inform our programming in developing approaches that are resilient to the impacts of climate change, but also to include in our programs some actions that can support the adaptability, the resilience of women and girls to the impacts of climate change in the response to child marriage and to female genital mutilation. Finally, there is going to be a paper that will actually look into how to even more integrate climate change across our mandate of UNFPA in order to achieve the 3 transformative results that I was mentioning before. Next, please. Now, the final zoom that I will do is into the national context, which is, of course, Jordan in our case. Jordan is no different from the other countries in the region. And actually also here, climate hazards have been increasing in frequency and intensity in the past decade, with impacts that have resulted in losses of human lives, in destruction of agricultural land, in damages to infrastructures. And one of the most pressing issues faced by Jordan is that of water scarcity. Jordan is among the top 5 most water-stressed countries in the world. And just looking at the data, actually the per capita water availability in the country is 5 times less than the global threshold for severe water scarcity. So we are at 100 squared cubic meters to 500 cubic meters, which is the global threshold. And the evidence shows that actually this is going to worsen in the coming years, and the impacts of water shortages have already started manifesting and are, of course, unfortunately, expected to become even more severe. Now, to be looking then at how Jordan is trying to address this in terms of policy, and how, as UNFPA, we are going to support this process, I'm just going to leave the floor to my colleague, Rasha. Thank you.
Thank you, Jada. And so hello, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much to Kvinna and Oxfam for inviting us for this really very important webinar. And also, I looked at the series, and thank you very much really for your effort. So we saw what are, let's say, the situation, the climate change situation in Jordan. So what is been going on to respond to those situations? So there have been a number of national policies that respond also to the impact of climate change, which also integrate and are gender mainstream, including the Jordan National Climate Change Policy, the National Adaptation Plan, and the Third National Jordan, which all recognize the importance and the value of integrating a gender perspective in climate change action, which are all also managed and organized by the Ministry of Environment. And it is very important to say that Jordan is the first country in the region to integrate a gender equality perspective in its national climate change policy. Let me speak about the Jordan National Climate Change Policy, which provides the overarching framework for developing adaptation and mitigation strategies for priority and affected sectors, such as water, energy, agriculture, and biodiversity. And although efforts are still primarily
I'm sorry for interrupting you, but the voice is a little bit vague. I don't know if you could get closer maybe to the mic or...
Okay. Try this. Is it now better?
Yeah, way better. Thank you.
Better. Okay, good. Apologize for that. So the government of Jordan has voluntarily committed to reducing its gas emissions level to 31% by 2030. And also this policy also, as I said, it addresses the impact of climate change on vulnerable groups. And when we speak about vulnerable groups, we also, of course, include women and girls. And it highlights the importance of mainstreaming gender equality perspective as well. So this policy, it outlines the significance of mainstreaming gender perspective into both general and sector-specific policies and strategies through different objectives. So also there has been the Jordan's National Women Commission here in Jordan, which is the national machinery for Jordan, also launched a paper or a national strategy called the Jordanian National Strategy for Women, which focuses on women's rights and gender equality across different thematic areas. And while climate change is not explicitly mentioned in the strategy, but however, one of the outputs under the strategic outcome 2, which stipulates that women and girls are capable of accessing their human, economic, and political rights, and really lead and participate in a society free of gender-based discrimination, which also can include the need for the response to climate change, which impacts women's and girls' capability of accessing their human, economic, and political rights, but also this strategic outcome, it also calls for women's participation, including in climate change action. And I also, it's very important also in this slide to say that recently also the Ministry of Environment, together with UNDP, they developed a report called Gender Equality and Climate Change in Jordan, which is also, you can also, it's available on both websites, and you can find more about what has been going on the policy level related to climate change and what are the challenges on that specific and having a more gender analysis on those policies. So next slide. So more on what UNFPA Jordan did this year. So this year, and specifically on the occasion of International Women's Day, as this year, the global theme was titled Gender Equality Today for a Sustainable Tomorrow. And it recognized the contribution of women and girls around the world, and including in Jordan, who are leading the charge on climate change adaptation, mitigation, and response. But also it reflected on the impacts of climate change on women and girls, and including the increasing risks of gender-based violence. So on that occasion, UNFPA Jordan collaborated with the Information and Research Center, King Hussein Foundation, and Sama Consulting to develop a research brief on climate change and gender-based violence, which aimed to highlight the impact of climate change on women and girls here in Jordan, and understanding more the situation of climate change in Jordan and then its impacts on women and girls, with a particular focus on gender-based violence. So the methodology used in this research brief, it is first a qualitative research, which was exploratory and based on extensive review of literature in global, regional, and including national also level on climate change and gender-based violence. It conducted 8 key informative interviews with gender and environmental experts, and also women champions working in the environmental climate change sectors. And also a focus group discussion was conducted with GBV case managers, gender-based violence case managers, to examine the impact of climate change on women and girls in Jordan. So this paper started with giving first global evidence. So in the global evidence identifies 3 main factors which make women and girls more vulnerable to climate change, including first, the increased likelihood of women living in poverty, their dependence or threatened natural resources, so their dependence on the threatened natural resources, and then the imbalance in power, relations, role, and responsibilities due to patriarchy, social norms, which in the context of climate change, it diminishes the ability of women and girls to adapt, and also to adapt, to recover from the impacts of climate change, but also to participate and in climate change action. So based on this literature review and the key the interviews and the consultation that was conducted, the findings were that water distribution in Jordan is inequitable, with, of course, rural communities and refugees being the most marginalized. And while water is supplied to households through the municipal water network, supply is still inequitable. And households in the capital, so let's understand more how water is distributed in Jordan. So households in the capital Amman and in major urban centers receive water once a week, some areas twice a week. But households in rural areas and more remote locations receive water every 2 weeks. And to make up for water shortage, some households have tanks to store municipal water, and others need to buy water to meet various household needs, such as for drinking, cooking, and cleaning.
And households living in poverty and marginalized communities are, of course, at higher risk of water shortage and have a lower capacity to cope. And when we take it more, when we try to think how it impacts women and girls, we found out that women usually tend to prioritize other tasks, including house cleaning, cooking, bathing their kids, but they do not prioritize, for example, their health, which we found out that they faced barriers in their menstrual hygiene management, as an example, and we will go more to speak about that aspect more. So women living in poverty and also female-headed households are more likely to suffer from lack of resources and less likely to have the means of cope. So in 2019, the government of Jordan announced a new national poverty rate of 15.7%. And this meant that more than 1 million Jordanians lived below the poverty line. And of course, a higher number was on women. So while there are no updated, let's say, sex disaggregated poverty figures, existing evidence suggests that women in poverty tend to be, of course, more vulnerable, especially family-headed households. So the impacts of them are, let's say, increasing, and they are considering us more vulnerable. Another findings of the literature review and the consultation was that with the responsibility of managing water resources inside the household, it's mainly falling on women, and they are more likely to be the ones who suffer when water is scarce. And so many women in Jordan are responsible for, we found out when the consultation that many women in Jordan are responsible for the management of all household related chores, including cooking, cleaning, and the management of water resources. They are more likely to be responsible for rationing water, prioritizing also household chores, as I said before, according to its availability and finding ways to cope when it's scarce, placing additional pressure on their role as caretakers and resulting in increased psychological stress, but also not prioritizing their health, including menstrual health. Also, water scarcity is also likely to lead to increased tensions between family members and intimate partner violence. And of course, as we all know, violence against women remains to be accepted despite all of the efforts to reduce it, and especially intimate violence. Women continue to remain silent about any abuse, especially intimate partner violence, and of course they're reporting, but still only a few seek support. Also, we can go back, for example, to COVID-19 and link it to how emergencies, because when we speak about climate change, is also a global emergency, and maybe we can also build on what lessons learned have we learned from the previous emergency and crisis that impacted everyone, and including women and girls. And UNFPA did a study back in COVID-19 on the impacts of COVID-19 on women and girls, on specifically on gender-based violence and on their sexual and reproductive health and rights. And one of the findings was that around 62% of women reported increased threat of physical and psychological violence against them, especially during lockdown. Also, some experts explained when doing the consultation that water scarcity is similar, we can take it as similar to scarcity of any other resources, such as money and food, is likely to result in gender-based violence, especially in homes where violence against women is normalized. So whenever resources are scarce in the household, there is tension and there is stress, giving the patriarchal norms, the anger, the frustration are often taken out, unfortunately, on women and girls. Whether it is scarcity of water or money or any resources that a household needs to survive, the anger is usually taken out on women. So that's where we see a nexus between gender-based violence and scarcity of water. Also, girls might be at risk of carrying additional unpaid care responsibilities, and which may also may lead for their dropout of school or even exposed to early marriages. And here is a quote, because we did back also on the occasion, we did a consultation with women and girls to develop some key messages on the topic to understand climate change and to hear more from them. What are the linkages and what is the situation among women and girls when it's related, when we speak about the relation or the integration between gender-based violence and climate change. And a 30-year-old Jordanian woman who lives in Deir Alla said, "My husband used to beat me, shout and threaten me whenever the crops get damaged. It is not my fault. It is the heat that is destroying them, and we cannot afford bringing equipment to protect them from the weather." So extreme weather conditions destroy livelihoods and in turn exacerbates poverty. So when families are unable to meet their basic needs, evidence suggested that the risk of violence, and also it could include also child marriage, increases significantly for both women and girls. So yes, we find that these circumstances and how this is how it can be linked climate change to gender-based violence, that within these and especially women who rely on natural resources and families who rely on natural resources, climate change are impacting the weather conditions, which can lead either to a higher temperature or a very low temperature, which in both ways destroy the crops. And due to the social norms and the patriarchy and the gender inequality, most of the times the violence are on women and girls when such conditions happen. Another quote from another woman, and it's a Syrian woman living in the capital of Jordan. "Unlike people, I get afraid when it rains heavily, snows, or even when a storm starts. I'm afraid that the electricity suddenly stops and I can't ask for help nor call the case manager." So also, when climate change impacts the access of women and girls to seek for help, access services, and access also information. It is important to say here that there is a gender digital divide, and women and girls are also less likely to own a mobile phone. So when they cannot go out due to climate change impacts, and they do not own a mobile phone, they feel even more additional barriers to access help when they are especially survivors of gender-based violence. Also, the findings of the paper showed that water shortages coupled with financial constraints are likely to impact women and girls during the menstrual cycle. And so several key informants pointed out issues faced by some women in Jordan during their menstrual cycles as a result of water shortages. And it is so a research has been conducted with women in Mafraq, looked at the issue of period poverty. And when we say period poverty, we mean the lack or the inability to access hygiene products and health services related to the menstrual cycle, which includes hygiene and the access to hygiene and water facilities for personal hygiene, health education, sexual and reproductive health education, sexuality education, and the methods of waste management of menstrual products. And according to the World Bank reports, period poverty affected nearly 5 million women and girls worldwide, of whom 107 million are Arab women and girls. And so UNFPA also currently this year is developing with a women's-led organization called Taqatu'at, a policy paper on period poverty, which came as a response to a research conducted in Mafraq by a local NGO that said that more than 70% of women and girls in Mafraq are subjected to period poverty. So we did this we are currently in the process of finalizing also this policy paper. And to develop this policy paper, we targeted women and girls between the ages of 15 and 49 in both refugee communities and host communities in Azraq refugee camp, in Irbid, which is in the northern side of Jordan, in Zarqa, more in the central of Jordan, and in Karak, the southern of Jordan. So we try to cover different areas in Jordan, to understand more, okay, is this situation only in Mafraq or is it across Jordan? And we found out that yes, women are they are being subjected to period poverty. And one of the findings also in that paper was the relation between water scarcity and the inability to access water into their menstrual hygiene. Also, girls' inability to safely manage their menstrual cycle in schools could become a factor for girls drop out of school if water shortage problems continue to increase. Next slide, okay. The lack of water, so this also is a quote from a woman, 40-year-old Syrian woman in Zaatari camp, which said that the lack of water has affected my reproductive and menstrual health. I need to ensure I use the water properly for bathing my kids, cleaning, and cooking. I can't afford paying for additional water. And here, and this statement or this quote has been also raised by different women when we did the consultation, that they used to prioritize other causes and used to prioritize bathing their kids, etc., but not prioritize their health. So which impacts their reproductive and menstrual health. Also, a case study on women in Azraq camp was in the research brief, and it showed that. So let's first, before saying the findings, let's start to understand how is the water distribution in Azraq camp. The water in Azraq camp is distributed through the water supply network to 300 tap stands. And this results in a daily average water distribution of 60 liters per person per day, which is considerably, it's lower than the national per capita day distribution of 90 to 100 liters. And it's important to say that in Azraq camp, water does not come to the homes, that it's not distributed to the homes, but families and people need to go to specific taps to get the water, for whether for cleaning or cooking or any other course. So approximately every 7 families share a water tap from which they collect the water that is supplied every few days for a certain number of hours. And it's important also to say, and based on the research that has been conducted, that most women in Azraq camp are primarily tasked with collecting water from these taps. And based on the consultation, the study, it was found that, and with the responsibility of collecting water from the taps, this increased the risks to verbal abuse and sexual harassment when they go to get the water. And also female head households in Azraq camp faced heightened risks of violence and harassment, and conservative social norms which results in underreporting. And it's also interesting to say that women tend to stand in a row to get water. And imagine high temperatures, imagine waiting to get the water in high temperature or sometimes even very low temperature. Imagine how this will affect the well-being and the health of women and girls. Women, as we said, might be also subjected to sexual exploitation when there is, especially when sometimes they may ask for additional water, which has been raised also in the consultations that we did with women and girls. Female head households might need to take their children and the caretakers with them when bringing the water. So leading to more psychological stress. In Azraq camp, also the bathrooms are shared. Now some caravans have extended the size of the caravan to have the bathrooms there, but it is shared also due to the water situation in the camp. And it has been also shown that women also tend to reuse water, especially when cleaning. they reuse it in order to manage the water that they use. Climate change is not gender neutral, and neither should climate action be. So we spoke about the impacts of climate change on women and girls, but we also need to highlight the importance of women's participation and active participation and inclusion in climate action. So women not only have a role to play in tackling the climate change threats, but also their knowledge, their experiences, their voices and views can better guide the actions adopted and make it more friendly to the needs of women and girls, and make sure that women and girls' needs are included in the policies developed. And excluding women from these processes and overlooking their needs, interests, and it will continue to ensure that women and girls are still vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And so the limited participation of women in public life limits their contribution to climate adaptation and mitigation efforts. And it has been shown that in Jordan's scores for political participation are low, still are low. Only 15.4% of the parliament members are women, which also impacts the inclusion of the needs of women and girls in the different policies on national level. And while women's participation in climate change discussion is still limited on policy level, there are several grassroots initiatives founded or co-founded by women with the aim of contributing to environmental sustainability. And here, I would like to highlight that also on the occasion of International Women's Day, we did this recycling competition calling young women mainly and adolescent girls to participate in their initiatives. And really, when we received those amounts of initiative, it's impressive to see the amount of efforts that being conducted, but unfortunately, it's not seen. And as an example, there was an initiative where she converted sand into mud, and this mud supported in how it suddenly came out from this mud. Suddenly it came out grass and trees. So imagine how, if really there is a need really to provide more opportunities for women and girls to participate with these kind of initiatives. Another initiative is a woman that collects plastic bags from the streets, and she converts them into materials and buys them. So additionally, it empowers her economically. So imagine the amount of ideas and initiatives are being conducted. So I will stop talking and I will leave back to my colleague Jada to also state the recommendations that this paper addressed and found.
Thank you, Rasha. And just to quickly jump back into this contribution and to round it up. As Rasha was mentioning, there are, of course, several issues that have been highlighted by the research that we've been carrying out. And some of the recommendations are actually almost all in line with the regional or global researches that have been carried out on this. So mostly we look at data, lack of data, and so a strong need to produce specifically sex disaggregated data in research on climate change in Jordan, which includes gaps of impacts of water shortages, of increased temperatures, of food insecurity, droughts, flash floods on individuals, but also on families residing across different communities in the country. So general data about climate change, but also then specifically going more in depth into data on climate change and the impact of GBV in Jordan. We've started, but clearly there is so much more that needs and should be done. And these data will be very important to advocate for campaigns on the importance of addressing GBV, and to use it to create better and more informed programs and interventions. Of course, it's important to focus also on risk reduction and enhance the preparedness of communities. And this cannot be done with a silo thinking approach. It needs to be tackled with a multi-sectorial response that can, on one hand, avoid duplications in service delivery, and on the other, can actually ensure that interventions are holistic and they are sustainable. So we need to bring to the coordination tables livelihood, GBV, education, WASH sectors, so they can all together actually sit and craft some interventions that are really at 360 degrees looking into the problem. Next, please. And finally, clearly we need to, as I was saying at the beginning of the presentation, look into the sensitivities of each context and of each group of the population. We need to look at different experiences and needs of men, women, boys and girls with regards to environmental issues and climate change. And every intervention needs to be really contextualized and tackle the different priorities of each group. Speaking of each group, clearly we need to focus on, and that's what we advocate for, the inclusion, as Rasha was saying, of women and young people, participation of women in climate action, including through support to women's organization at the policy, at the community level, is important, very important, so that we can ensure that they can effectively contribute to the adaptation and the mitigation responses. And then, of course, we need to drill down at the community level, and we need to specifically look into the inclusion of young people, their voices as global and local leaders on climate change, so they can receive the support that they need in building their own resilience. Now, we are just going to leave you with a powerful quote that I think is quite telling in terms of stressing the urgency of the issue. And we are just going to thank you for your time.
Wow. Thank you so much, Ghada and Rasha, for sharing with us the work of the UNFPA and their focus in different levels, starting from the regional, national, and going to focus on Jordan. And it was very interesting to hear about how climate change and especially water scarcity is affecting the Arab world, and with the fact that it's hitting worse in 11 Arabic countries. And the facts that Jordan is one of the first countries to work in the region, to work with integrating the gender equality when it comes to climate action. And it was also very powerful and interesting to see the impact of climate change and women focused on the violence, the gender-based violence that they faced due to the climate change crisis and the impact that comes with it, and ended up with the recommendations of how can we face these challenges from different perspectives. Very thankful. Thank you so much. And I want to invite our participants to share with us their questions using the questions and answers icon in the bottom of the screen. Thank you. Great. So our next speaker is Vanessa Farr, and she's going to speak in English. Vanessa is a feminist peace activist who works on the intersectional gendered impacts of militarization and climate disruption. She holds a PhD from the School of Women's Studies at York University, Toronto, Canada. She's also a long-standing member of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and has published 2 books and several articles and chapters on gender and crisis. Vanessa will explore gender-based violence and sexual and reproductive health in the light of the intergenerational impacts of war toxins, and will also give some insights into connections between agriculture inputs and military toxins. Vanessa, very happy to have you with us again, and the mic is yours. Welcome.
Thank you, shukran. It's lovely to be back with everybody, and I really want to thank our UNFPA colleagues for such an excellent presentation, because it is quite hard to conceptualize how we're supposed to think about environment and gender, and that's brilliant little case study, well, not little, that huge case study that you've boiled down for us is really wonderful. I think that helps us a lot to understand what we are looking at. So I'm going to take the conversation in a very different direction, just to give you some other things to think about. So I'm going to share my screen over there. Come on. There we go. What I'm going to talk to you about today is to take some of our conversation from last week forward, which I hope some of the people in the audience today were at last week, and to really think about what is a protective ecosystem? Is there a way to differently think about addressing and preventing gender-based violence by actually starting to think about ecosystems? And I don't know if you remember last week that the speaker from WILP spoke about the fact that we shouldn't really be talking about a climate crisis, but more an ecological crisis. She's absolutely correct, because the word ecology, as you might remember, means the household. So let's think about what that possibly means. I've got a bunch of ideas on this paper that I'm on this page that I'm going to talk through with you, because I think there's some bigger questions that we can address. The first one is that I think we need to start to really understand that gender-based violence is bigger than the individuals who suffer from its effects. Gender-based violence forms part of a system of dominance. It, of course, comes profoundly from patriarchy, but it is very, very importantly inflected by racism and coloniality. And the ecocide that we are seeing in the world right now is one of the intersectional variables that makes gender-based violence part of a system. So what does patriarchy do? How many of you have heard of the expression, the patriarchal bargain? This is a way in which men are taught by men with more power that the power that men have can only come from physical, sexual, and monetary domination, and that this domination is by men over women, over children, and over the more than human world. You might remember that expression from last week. The more than human world is every other living form on this planet that isn't human. Monetary domination is really the basis of the ecocidal aspect of this exploitative triangle, because it is associating men with the things that they've got, the stuff that they can own, that has really misled a lot of men, especially men who are poorer, away from solidarity with women and people from their own communities, especially in poor communities, towards a corporatized agenda that believes in extraction for the form of making money. Now, we do need to ask ourselves, why is it that men particularly have been able to be caught up in that story? I think part of the problem is that it's a version of male power that allows men to take much more than they give back. And that example from Jordan of refugee women standing in line for hours in the hot heat, waiting for water, always the same people in the family. It's always the woman, it's always the girls who have to go and collect the water. You might notice that the patriarchal bargain is at work there, right? The difficult work is the work that is given to women. And this is the power, men taking more than they give back. They're not in relationship anymore in their families. They're not in relationships of equality. But the bigger problem with this is that it is this bargain, this version of male power that is really behind what's destroying the earth. And we do need to think about the fact that it destroys the equal rights of women. We know that, we talk about that all the time. It certainly takes away rights from girls and boys. In other words, it has a very strong youth dimension. But what's difficult about this problem is that it is also impacting on some men. So the ways in which men are drawn into the bargain is that they want to be the men who have dominant power. They look at the men who are supposedly successful, who we are told are successful under this capitalist model where they're driving big cars, they're wearing expensive clothing, they've got the best shoes. And those men that are underneath want that. And they will do virtually anything to get those status symbols. As our colleagues from UNFPA have just explained to us about Jordan, this dominance model is what is preventing the full participation in the political, social, and economic development of communities and resources, right? That's the environmental aspect. And it affects women and men alike. One of the other challenges that we have to look at, and again, our colleagues from Jordan gave us such a good example of this, that individual men's violence against individual women, so we think about that, don't we? We think about that individual level where a relationship has gone wrong. But above that is a superstructure of the state and corporate violence over everybody and over the earth. And we are now in a stage in the world's history where corporations have more power than states. And I want you to remember that a lot of colonial history goes back to a time when corporations set out from Europe to make money and to colonize. Coloniality and corporatism are very, very strongly connected to one another. And when we think about these superstructures of state violence and we think about these superstructures of corporate violence, Jordan is a very, very important example. So just to go back to what some of our colleagues were saying, 11 of the 17 most water scarce countries in the world are in the Middle East and North Africa. But that's not new. They've always been water scarce countries. That's a matter of geography. All of the countries in West Asia and North Africa are in the rain shadow of the Himalaya mountains. They have always been water scarce. The Sahara Desert that stretches across the whole of the top of North Africa is produced by the geography of Earth. So what has shifted? Arab countries, Arab people have always known how to handle water, how to manage water brilliantly. They've always had very different ideas about water management from what was dominant in the Western or European model, where there was just always more water around. It's very important for us to consult the archaeology and to understand that coloniality, because it takes away indigenous people's knowledge and says that individuals and indigenous societies don't know as much as what comes from the West. They have destroyed the knowledge of water management. We talked a little bit about the difficulties of menstrual hygiene management, but the problem with the Western ideal of water, this is a Victorian model, so you know that it goes back 100 years to when coloniality really took hold in your region. The Victorian model is that shit and pee, the products of a human body, go into water. That water will take those things away. And this is just plainly wrong and stupid and savage and uncivilized. And in fact, the places in the world that are now the Arab states have never made the error of putting human bodily waste into water. That is a new problem. It's a new problem that's only been around for 50, 60, 70 years, depending on how developed the country pretends to be. The other problem that we're facing, that Jordan is facing very particularly, is that its water scarcity is politically produced. Why is Jordan becoming more and more water scarce? Because Jordan receives refugees. From a century ago, from the Nakba, Jordan has received Palestinian refugees. But Jordan has taken in Iraqi refugees, it took in Lebanese refugees, it takes in Syrian refugees. There are too many people being displaced by war in that region. And because Jordan has managed to hold on to a state of neutrality, a certain state of neutrality, people flood in. It is a politically produced water scarcity. One of the very biggest problems that Jordan faces is the existence of one of the most violent settler colonial states right next door. To the west of Jordan, militarily occupied Palestine is a water catastrophe. It is a climate catastrophe in the making, and it is deliberate. And the state of Israel has destroyed the river of Jordan, and the state of Israel has stolen the headwaters, the waters in the mountains. in the occupied parts of Syria. So we have to look broadly at the regional complexities of what is going on here. And that's where corporate violence becomes an important part of this, because the state of Israel is also a mass producer of weapons systems that it exports around the world. And it is a mass producer of agricultural inputs, which you might remember me talking about last week, are a directly linked product to military inputs. So right next door to the state of Jordan is a large settler industrial military complex that is definitely affecting the ways that waters flow in that region. We need those bigger pictures to understand what's going on. So one of the things we really have to struggle with when we think about sexual violence, sexual and reproductive rights, is that violence-driven inequalities are actually passed from the father and the mother to the child. Now let's just think about this for a moment. As you know, it takes sperm and an egg for a child to be formed. We know that men's sperm counts, the quality and the mobility, the motility as they call it, of sperm around the world is massively declining. Men's fertility is dropping precipitously, dangerously around the world. Why is that? Largely, it's because of exposure to toxins. And those toxins are both agricultural toxins and military toxins, once again. We also know that children are receiving pollution now inside the uterus. There used to be a sense that the placental barrier could not be crossed by toxins, but we now know that this is not true. Particularly polycarbon fluoride chains, which are created often in association with militarization. Those are able to cross the barricade. The placenta is no longer able to protect the child. And interestingly enough, and you might be surprised to hear this, what the fetus receives will show up in their life differently for male fetuses and for female fetuses. And I'm sure many of you have become aware of this terrible sudden rise in autism amongst children. And I'm sure that many of you will know that the research is showing that autism tends to show up more in boys than it does in girls. We're now starting to understand that this is something that gets passed on intergenerationally. And I'll talk to this a little bit more, just in case it's a new idea to you. So what is this telling us? It's telling us that all these forms of violence, these forms of gendered violence, these forms of reproductive and sexual violence are cyclical, and they can become intergenerational unless individuals and communities refuse to support that system, which I will talk about a little bit more. What has all of this got to do with ecology? I think what's important here is that we remember that the word ecology, we use that word in English, derives from the Greek word for house or home. So ecology is the study of our dwelling place. It's the study of where we live, what surrounds us in our life, and what allows us to live. So as a form of violence that is associated most strongly with the home space, I'm going to propose to you that we need to think about gender-based violence as an anti-life form of violence and a form of violence that contributes to ecocide and is produced by environmental crisis, as our colleagues from Jordan explained to us. Go on, move on. Why isn't it going? There we go, sorry. We talked about intersectionality a little bit in the first slide, where I said there are these three different parts, at least three different parts. I've chosen to focus on three. But there's also this problem of intersectionality in the ways in which official and state and international responses are constructed. So one of the things that you will have noticed in your work is that women and children become kind of pushed together. They're blurred together. And most of the literature that we've got, most of the international humanitarian law and international human rights law sort of blurs the lines between a child's rights and needs and those of a woman. This is a very interesting problem because there's reasons why we've developed, obviously, a particular set of frameworks through which to try to understand the suffering that is being imposed on women. But one of the things that it produces is that women are infantilized. Women are kept as if they were children. And this has a lot to do with driving that problem that we see that our Jordanian colleagues spoke to us about, of women's lack of participation in the public space. Women then become the people who do the work, but not make the decisions. And then in that same equation, we didn't talk about men very much in the Jordan presentation, but think about what happens to men. If women are children, if women are like children, then men become the protector. And that means that men are under a lot of pressure. Remember that woman who said, my husband beats me when it doesn't rain. He beats me when the plants die from heat, as if I had anything to do with the weather. What that man is expressing is that he cannot do anything to protect. His hoped for role as a protector has been taken away from him through a climate over which he has no control. And because he's been shown and told that as a dominant male, he can use violence, that is what he chooses to do. He expresses his own pain, and his broken relationship with the land and the rain and the seeds and the plants turns into a broken relationship with a woman. This problem then becomes a difficult one, as I'm sure our colleagues will tell you, and any of you who've ever tried to write a shadow report or tried in any way to use these international legal protections, you find yourself coming up against this problem that you've got to go to different sources. You have to draw on the Convention on the Rights of the Child when you want to talk about children, and you have to talk about CEDAW. You need to use CEDAW when you talk about women. But what do you do in the situation that we've just heard about in Jordan, where girls are being married younger and younger? Is a 15-year-old a woman? Does she fall under CEDAW, or should she fall under the CRC? Where do you go for help? And then, of course, the problem with these international legal protections that focus on children, focus on women, but there isn't an international convention for men, because all of the conventions apply to men, right? And women and children are somehow have to be specially catered for. But what that does is it makes non-dominant men invisible. So where are the refugee men? Where are the poor men living in water-scarce areas where they don't have the resources? That man who can't build tunnels to protect his crops. Where does he fit? Where in the instruments do we find him? And then, of course, we are the inheritors of 500 years of European colonial thinking that, in denying relationships and insisting on dominance, says, we humans are not part of this world. We are not part of our home. We are superior to it. We are dominant over it. We know better. And that is very deeply written into all of the laws that we've got, international laws, that you can't really think about environmental destruction and human suffering using the same conventions. There's a whole slew of conventions on environment, and there's a whole slew on human rights, but they don't speak to each other necessarily, which is why the kind of work that UNFPA is doing in Jordan is so important, where they're trying to bring the literature together and look at the relationships between these different protections so that they can start to draw new conclusions that will help them to design programs that are more responsive to the reality. And then the deepest blow of all, the hardest thing I think of all, is that War-torn countries like those in West Asia and North Africa suffer not just from this immediate war that they're experiencing now, the wars since, for instance, 2011, the wars since 1948 and before. But there are also societies that have been made patriarchal and sexist as a particular weapon of colonization. There's very interesting archival evidence, particularly from West Asia, about a very different way of men and women relating to each other before the colonialists arrived and imposed Western ideas. And this has built a society that clings to aspects of religion, for instance, that make it very difficult for patriarchy to be approached as something that is an idea that we can take on. It's been presented to us as the normal way. There is no other way. We have to go quite far back in the historical archives to find out that this violence against women by men was not always the way. But the problem is that when a society is deeply patriarchal and deeply sexist, before a crisis happens, it has worse effects on women and children, exactly as we've just learnt in the case study of Jordan. As soon as people become refugees, those old habits of dominance get stronger. They don't diminish, given the new crisis that people are sharing. They actually get stronger. And we need to think about what's going on to make that possible. I'd like to now turn to a really helpful theoretical framework that can support us to think differently about what might be going on. And here I'm referring to the wonderful book by Rob Nixon, written in 2011. So it's already a decade old, and it remains one of my most important reference tools, because he has asked us to refine our responses by complicating the timelines of what we're doing. We don't have to just be in the now of the climate catastrophe and its production. We need to think back in time, and we need to think forward in time. There's a wonderful expression used by indigenous communities of Turtle Island, the place now known as North America, where people say, we think through 7 generations. I'm sure there's an Arabic equivalent of that saying, because it's about where do we come from and where do we go. And I'm going to go back now to what I was telling you earlier about sexual and reproductive health and the ways in which environmental destruction is starting to affect, or has been affecting us for the last 100 years. The question that then comes up is, when and where is vulnerability? When and where is vulnerability? Rob Nixon tells us that a lot of it is about the stories that we're told. And he specifically refers to the media, and he specifically refers to the issue of spectacular violence, you know, the stuff that hits the screens. 16 children shot to death in a school in America. Massive earthquake in Afghanistan. The stuff that gets to the top of the media poll. But what is problematic about that way of storytelling is it isn't interested in the long, slow violence that's affecting us. Nixon says it lacks the attention span. I think that's quite useful. It doesn't have the attention to look at the long, long, long impacts of war. Those of you who are listening today from Iraq, and those of you who are listening from Palestine, especially Gaza, know very well what I mean when I say war-inflicted catastrophes take years or they take generations to show up. So where does war end? In some countries around the world, we know that official victory has been declared, right? The Americans have declared official victory, for instance, in Kuwait in 1991. But what about the war that goes on, as Nixon calls it, in the cellular domain? The war that goes on in the body at the cellular level. That untidy lethality, where you don't get a clinically clean strike, not that a clinically clean strike exists, but this idea that you have a clean drone strike that smacks down and hits a particular body and takes out a leader, and now you've solved some of the problem of warfare. It doesn't do that. That is not how war works, because wars are toxic. They are desperately, terrifyingly, horribly toxic. And so what happens when you are exposed to the lethality of war is that even if you're not one of the people who gets killed immediately, that war stays in your tissue, in your blood, in your bones, whether you were fighting in the war as a combatant, whether you were a medic who arrived early on the scene to help people who'd been hurt, or whether you were just a passerby. That toxic material stays behind. And, of course, it stays in the body of the land itself. And here it might interest you to know that one of the ways in which the current toxic agricultural model, big agriculture that relies on fossil fuel-based inputs, fertilizers, herbicides, etc., that a lot of those discoveries were made at the end of the Second European War, and even at the end of the First European War, when the following year after the war had ended, all of those lands that had been blown up in the spectacle of war suddenly were very fertile. And it took them a long time to work out that actually gunpowder and its residues, so the residues of military material can actually, strangely enough, temporarily make the soil more fertile. That's one of the ways in which they came to producing the toxins that we now associate with agriculture. So both the land and the body of people who are inflicted, who are in war-inflicted situations, are affected, but for decades beyond the actual war. So let's think then about slow violence and gender-based violence next to one another. Slow violence is a lot like gender-based violence in that it's a violence that occurs gradually and out of sight. And you'll remember that our colleagues from Jordan said one of the problems with trying to understand where women are and how they're experiencing violence is that they don't talk about it. It happens behind the tent wall. It happens quietly. It's not something we can talk about easily. And in that, it's almost exactly the same as militarized violence. I want you to think about what that connection is telling us. It's a violence that happens in delayed ways. Women struggle with post-traumatic stress disorder for decades after they've survived a violent marriage. And so do men, although we hardly talk about that. We'll see in a little moment what that can look like. And the strange thing about it is that it is dispersed across time and space. It is not happening in the moment that we think it is happening in. It's a violence that eats away at us, that just breaks us down, breaks us down, breaks us down. But it often isn't really seen as violence at all. And in those ways, for me, it's so frighteningly familiar to gender-based violence. War violence and gender-based violence are so similar because they're hidden, they're slow, they're difficult to talk about, they're difficult to prove. You know, as our colleagues from UNFPA said, we've got to get more data before people will actually believe the evidence that's in front of us. So what you need, unfortunately, is a mass movement of resistance against these forms of violence that say no to state violence, that say no to corporate violence. We need a big public awareness campaign because gender-based violence, and feminists have been saying this to us for 50 or 60 years now, gender-based violence is only possible because we don't talk about it enough. Gender-based violence becomes slow violence. Slow violence and militarized violence connect with one another. The earth dies slowly. What shifts for us when we redefine gender-based violence as a symptom of the ongoing coloniality in which everyone in West Asia and North Africa is living. When we take it out of the realm of the intimate, we don't talk about it anymore as just being violence that men do to women because they can, because it's socially acceptable, because life is hard. What instead happens when we say gender-based violence is a symptom of coloniality? And coloniality, as we know from last week, is the driver of climate catastrophe. Can you see how all of these threads need to be connected in order for us to react in more effective ways? Just briefly back to the intergenerational effects of toxins, and I apologize to those of you joining us today from Iraq and Syria and possibly Lebanon and definitely from Gaza, who know this only too painfully well, who are seeing the babies delivered, human babies and non-human babies, because domestic animals are being terribly affected by the violent residues of war. What is happening now, and this is the sexual and reproductive health violence that I want to talk to, is that children in war zones are showing up. They're being born, if they manage to be born at all, with terrible genetic defects. They are born dead, stillborn, we say in English, or they are malformed. Their bodies do not grow correctly, because war crosses generations, as I said earlier. And war has an effect on our very genetic makeup. It is breaking our bodies before we are even born. That's the babies that you can see the impacts on. The babies where it's going to show up later are the babies who are those little boys who can't sit in a classroom. They can't concentrate. They suffer from attention deficit disorder, as diagnosticians like to talk about it. But what's actually showing up in them is the toxins that have been put into their little bodies before they could even breathe, while they were still being carried inside their mother. How do we prove that? How do we prove that? This is exactly what Nixon asks us to think about. We were talking about gathering evidence earlier. But war deaths from environmental toxicity take an incredible machinery of research to show. You've got to be able to correlate all of these illnesses: renal collapse, infertility, leukemia, testicular cancers, brain cancers, breast cancers, infant malformations, looking at children and at non-human babies. How do we show that that is directly resulting from war? How do we show that that's directly resulting from war-like agriculture? Especially when we live in a world where those big corporates and those massive, massive companies producing armaments control all the information. They control the flows of information. They control the stories. Some of you might be hearing about a slowly emerging class action lawsuit that's slowly happening in the States, where people are starting to be able to prove that their cancers were definitely formed by a toxin, an agricultural toxin called glyphosate, of which you might have heard. But the producers of that toxin, who incidentally are the same company, Bauer is one of the producers of glyphosate. It is the same company that produced the poisons that were used in the gas chambers of the Second European War by Hitler. Just think about that. The same company that produced those gases that were used to kill Jews and queers and people with disabilities in the Second European War. They now produce glyphosate, and that is causing massive amounts of sickness and death in the world. But how do we prove it? How do we prove that this is one of the impacts of war. We have to be able to show that we're aware of the transgenerational biological impacts of toxins and damaged ecologies in general. We have to be able to show that it's not only the physical impacts that we're worried about, but also, of course, the mental impacts. And the mental impacts are very difficult to talk about because there's a big overshadowing. Those of you who were with us last week will remember that I said that a lot of the panic around climate catastrophe that's happening now is happening because white people are realizing what they've done. People who've been on the receiving end of coloniality have known for centuries about the mental toll that it takes. And if we think about gender-based violence as an expression of trauma, which I think we should, we start to see one of those mental impacts. But we are also now starting slowly to be able to prove about the physical connection to toxins. And that is called the epigenetic effect. In other words, the genetic effect that crosses different generations. That's research that's been conducted in Europe. 75, 80 years after the Second European War, they're able to show that the children of mothers who were pregnant during the famine, the war-produced famine that happened at the end of the war, were still showing signs of damage, genetic damage. 3 generations later, this is now the second and third generations since that war, especially, they were showing up in the body's patterning towards starvation. So strangely out of synchronicity, insulin levels, and other physical ailments. So especially this huge increase in diabetes and cancer that we're seeing across the Middle East and North Africa, across West Asia and North Africa. This is telling us that those long wars that have been endured in that region are starting to show up, are showing up more and more in bodies that were not even born when that war took place. This is how long our timeline has to be. So what this possibly leads us to is designing ourselves an ecological model of gendered vulnerability. And here I want to think with you a little bit about what happens when we move beyond our usual ideas of gender-based violence, producing those shocking and frightening results that we just learned about in Jordan. But what about if we start seeing that gender-based violence as part of this ecology, right? This breaking down of our home, the planet. So it's not just in the home in which we live, it's in this bigger home in which we live. It's important for us to complicate the timeframes and the locations of where wars take place. It's important to understand that our bodies don't know when the war has ended because the toxins don't disappear. The land and the water and the body does not come, that war doesn't come to an end. So the impacts of those gendered violences, we know about the trauma of children who grow up in families where they witness violence. We know that boy children who witness their father's violence against their mother are significantly higher, show a significantly higher likelihood of becoming abusers themselves. We know that girls who watch their fathers beat up their mothers are significantly more likely to be vulnerable to that kind of relationship. But we haven't yet thought about the fact that those toxins show up in our bodies. Yeah.
Vanessa, I'm sorry for interrupting you. But,
yeah.
We need to wrap up in a minute because we have 2 minutes to end the webinar.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Thanks. So this is what I think we need to start shifting. We need to start looking at these different resources of violence, and we need to look at it. We need to look at this sexual and reproductive health crisis differently. But I want to finish this talk today with a different input, because I I felt that we were missing a conversation about masculinity, and I think we should perhaps put this on the table now. And I'm going to go to the wonderful African-American feminist theorist, abolitionist theorist, Bell Hooks, who asked us about whether we could reclaim masculinity. And she says, you know, because one of the questions that was asked, the reason I put this quote up is that one of the very first questions that was asked in this webinar today was somebody said, but why is environmentalism making men more violent? Why is the environmental catastrophe making men more violent? And I think the problem is that the issue that we're asked to face is that masculinity is something that is being taught to men by a patriarchal domination model. Men are not being taught to see themselves as creative, as life-sustaining. They are not being taught to see themselves as environmentalists. They're not being taught to see themselves as men in a home, in a place that they live in. We're not asking men not to be men anymore, but we're asking men to think about what the meaning is of being in a world that is changing so quickly that it is unrecognizable to us. We're asking men to dissent against patriarchal masculinity because it traps them. It looks as if it's freeing. It makes them feel temporarily, thank God I'm not a woman, at least I'm not a woman. But that is what really needs to shift. We need to say no. We need to say no to dominant patriarchy, and we need to say no to domination over the earth. Because our very bodies, our very reproductive systems are telling us that we as human beings are destroying the conditions for our own lives. So I'll leave it there in the hopes that we have got some time to chat to one another. Lots of comments in the chat box.
Yes. Thank you so much for sharing with us. Shukran لك, Vanessa. Thank you so much. Yes, we are 1 minute behind. I just want to thank you so much for sharing with us a lot of learnings about how can we gain and look at the ecological approach from the gender-based violence, and about finding or refine our responses, and by sharing with us as well learnings of how can we do that. Thank you so much, Vanessa. Before we conclude, I want to invite the speakers to please have a look at the questions and answers that the participants have shared with you. Thank you so much, Rasha and Jada. I've seen that you've been doing that. I want to also give the opportunity for Vanessa to do that. And before we wrap up and share with you the next the information about our next webinar, I want to also, today's focus has been in gender-based violence. And I saw a lot of suggestions as well in the chat to take a minute of silence to honor and honor the latest 2 victims of gender-based violence, the university students, Naira Ashraf from Egypt and Iman Irshad from Jordan. So I want to invite you to take with me 1 minute of silence to honor them.